Welcome everyone, all you Laramigos and out there amigos, to the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research Think and Drink series of virtual talks. We hope you're all as well and healthy as possible given the state of the world in which we live. I am Ken Giroux, a member of the steering committee for the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research. Our title this evening is Suffrage and Its Legacies, Women, Politics, and the Vote, featuring a conversation with Ellen Carol Dubois, historian and author of Suffrage, Women's Long Battle for the Vote. Ellen will be in conversation with our very own Cathy Connolly. Welcome to both of you. In just a moment, I will introduce tonight's moderator, who will introduce our speakers and the rest of the evening. But first, a couple of technical notes. If you, as an attendee, want to see all of the speakers, you can press gallery view on your screen. If you want to see only the current speaker, you can press that same button again. It toggles back and forth between gallery view and speaker view. And there's only a few people in the session, so gallery view won't leave you with teeny tiny Hollywood squares. It won't be so bad. You can type comments and questions into the chat box, and all attendants and speakers alike will see them. You may also type questions into the Q&A box. There, only our speakers will see them. Today's T&D is an election season special. Our Think and Drinks are every other week, and this one is in between our every other weeks. The next regularly scheduled Think and Drink is October 27th, with a local politician, Carly Provenza, being the main discussant. If you want to keep in touch with us, you can send an email to humanities@uwyo.edu. I will type that address into the chat box shortly. You can also see the recordings of our past events on our YouTube channel, and I'll put that link into the chat box also. Okay, here we go. Tonight's moderator is Dr. Renee Laegreid, professor of American Studies and History, so she gets double the salary. No, that's probably not correct. Professor of American Studies and History here at the University of Wyoming. Please help me welcome Dr. Laegreid and our speakers. Renee, I will vanish, and now it's just three of you.
Thank you very much, Ken. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here to moderate this talk between two wonderful speakers. Suffrage has been such a big part of Wyoming this past year, a little more than a year, as we celebrate 150 years of Wyoming women voting, and of course, a 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. So Ellen Dubois is the author of numerous books. A textbook, which is very well known, co-authored with Lynn Dennell, entitled Through Women's Eyes, The American History with Documents, and a co-edited textbook with Vicky Ruiz, Unequal Sisters, an inclusive reader in U.S. women's history. Her most recent book, and I'll be the third person to put it up here, is Suffrage, Women's Long Battle for the Vote, which is really quite good. So if you want to know anything about suffrage, you should buy it. And of course, this traces the wide historical scope of the movement to win the vote for women. The book begins with the pre-Civil War years with the foremothers, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Sojourner Truth, and then explores the links between women's suffrage movement to the abolition of slavery. After the Civil War, Congress granted freed African American men the right to vote, but not white and African American women, which was, of course, a crushing disappointment. So Dubois traces the perseverance of suffrage leaders through the Jim Crow years into the reform era of progressivism, and centers the activism of African American women led by Ida B. Wells Barnett, who demanded voting rights even as white suffragists ignored them. So delighted to have you here with us. And of course, then we have Cathy Connolly, our own Cathy Connolly, professor of gender and women's studies, and a big part of our legislature fighting for equality. Dr. Connolly's research involves an examination of social stratifications and institutions, particularly the law and the economy. She's published pieces that address issues in Wyoming, including the wage gap between men and women and gay rights. In 2008, Cathy was elected to serve in the Wyoming House of Representatives, representing House District 13 in Laramie. In her legislative capacity, Connolly has also earned certificates from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and Western Legislative Academy for State Leaders. So with the introductions now here, Ellen, take it away.
Well, I'm going to sort of wait for questions, but I think Cathy wanted me to begin with a reading, a little quick reading. And right?
So one of the things that we gave a great introduction, but Ellen, you were an endowed chair, recently retired, but an endowed chair at UCLA.
No endowed chair, no chair for me.
Okay, all right, all right. I had that part wrong.
I sit on a folding chair.
But a very well-known and respected history, and one of the first kind of historians of suffrage. But that being said, and has had a long kind of career as a very well-known academic. But this book right here is a trade publication. And one of the things that struck me were the comments about how the book is like reading a novel, and it is. And so I thought it would be really fun to have Ellen read a little bit from it so that, you know, folks can see how you can have kind of academic work kind of for the popular and the public press, and for everyone to take a good listen and to read. So I thought it might be fun if Ellen read a little bit to us.
Thank you, Cathy. Yes, it's my first real trade book, and it was really a treat to, you know, those of you who are academics know what a drag it is to constantly be looking over your shoulder at what other academics are saying to and about you. I didn't have to do that in this book. I just wrote this for a public audience, and I knew that there would be a nice big public audience. I didn't know what the conditions of that would be. When I started working on this book, I thought, oh great, there would be a woman president. So on the contrary, this book appeared at a time when the danger to American democracy was growing. And I know this is a slightly different question than Cathy was going to ask later, but I think I'll sort of answer it now. You know, the popular audience, the public, thinks of history as something sort of frozen in time. It's facts. And one of the first things you learn when you start studying history, and especially when you start becoming a historian, is that the meaning of history changes constantly, and that the notion that history is revised is not a terrible thing. Revisionist history isn't a horrible thing. In fact, the more important the event, let's say in this case, the enfranchisement of American women, the more it changes in connection with the moment at which one is looking at it. So as I said, I was getting ready to write this book when I thought we would reach the sort of, what is it called? The glass ceiling, break the glass ceiling with a woman president. On the contrary, the book came out when the question of voting was becoming more and more dangerous and under assault. I'll just point out one other small little thing. Even when I finished the book, I paid no attention to something that 4 months later would be in the forefront, which is there was a pandemic in 1918. But I hadn't paid any attention to that pandemic because once again, the way that the present calls to you is constantly shifting. So I've become interested in the relationship between, like so many historians, I didn't even sort of pay any attention to the pandemic. And now to think of it as part of the suffrage movement itself. With that as a large introduction, I have the odd characteristic of actually liking my own writing. So I couldn't decide what I wanted to read. So I decided, what the hell, I'd read the part about Wyoming and Utah. And it starts in, this section starts in the 1870s when the 15th Amendment has been ratified, and efforts to get a woman suffrage amendment have been have failed, and they will not, U.S. constitutional amendment will not be raised again seriously for another 40 years almost. To quote Elizabeth Stanton, the constitutional door slammed shut, okay? And that sets the stage for Wyoming. So, and may I say that you are one of the only audiences that know that Wyoming wasn't a state in 1869. Everybody else thinks it was a state. Okay, so we begin. With the US Constitution's doors slammed shut, new efforts to secure the right to vote were now developing within the states. Footnote here. Actually, the US Constitution pretty much leaves control over voting to the states, and efforts in these Reconstruction years to transfer control to Congress failed, leaving us in the terrible position we currently are, in which states control voting and Congress has no control over it. Indeed, the 15th Amendment had been written to leave authority over voting in the states limited only by a constitutional ban against disfranchisement by race, color, or previous condition. Winning these victories, though they would have to be done state by state, would grant women full voting rights, including in federal elections. That is to say, when they were won at the state level, not at the territorial level. Anthony still did, quote, not believe in getting suffrage by state action. She remained convinced that gaining women's voting rights through any means but the US Constitution was an insult to women's claims to full citizenship and political equality. Nonetheless, Anthony was pragmatic enough to recognize that state action, quote, is the only way politicians will allow us to agitate the question. So I accepted of necessity. 2 Western territories had already enfranchised women, but territorial enfranchisement only meant the right to vote for a handful of territorial offices, nothing at the federal level. In 1869, in the midst of Reconstruction excitement over enlarging the franchise, the tiny legislature of the recently organized territory of Wyoming, population 9,000 white people, voted to enfranchise its 1,500 non-Native women residents. Perhaps the legislators wanted to attract white family-based settlers to a territory still overwhelmingly Native and sort of white minors in population. After vacillating a few days, the federally appointed governor signed the bill. The enfranchisement of white women became an important part of Wyoming's identity up to and through statehood in 1890. Despite its limits, it thrilled and encouraged suffragists nationwide, who, when opponents insisted that women voting would upend the social order, often cited its beneficent effects on the territory. One more paragraph. The enfranchisement of women in Utah Territory the next year was more contentious. From the beginning, it was bound up with controversies aroused by the territory's Latter-day Saints population, which still practiced polygamy. Whether LDS elders supported enfranchising women in order to boost the LDS electorate with multiple wives, or to cleanse it of any suspicion that its women were mistreated remains unclear. Non-LDS Utah residents supported women's enfranchisement because they were hopeful that when women were enfranchised, they would vote to end polygamy and regain their sacred monogamous marriage rights. In this expectation, they were disappointed. For the next 17 years, LDS women energetically defended both their political rights and their polygamous practices. They retained their franchise.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
So, Cathy, did you have more questions? Do we have questions from the audience? I've got a couple here to kick things off. So, Ellen, talking about Wyoming, why Wyoming was the first territory to vote. Why was that? What was it about Wyoming that made it special?
Well, I gave some of the more standard answers. The most standard answer is that Wyoming's white population was overwhelmingly made up of the kind of men who came into the territory, grabbed whatever stuff they could from the ground and from mining, and left immediately. So the legislature, which had just been created, wanted to create a more permanent population, white population. And the assumption was that if you attracted women, women brought with them families. There doesn't seem to be any, so that kind of explanation has a kind of class and racial bias to it. Because Native people, of course, were not included in the franchise. There's no indication that the legislators who debated suffrage said that. I think what's more to the point is that it's 1869. It's right in the middle of Reconstruction. It has yet become the case that national legislators have refused to grant women's suffrage. There does seem to be a little contention in the Wyoming legislature particularly among Democratic legislators, who I think controlled the first territorial legislature.
They're all Democrats, yeah.
Yeah. That they wanted to sort of offset, or how should we say this? They wanted to bring in women's suffrage as a counter to Black suffrage. So in that way, women's suffrage was a Democratic attempt to embarrass Black suffrage. But very quickly, certainly the governor and other appointed Wyoming politicians appointed by the Republican, by the Grant administration, these were Republicans, and they, for the most part, supported women's suffrage. So there's a kind of contention going on between these two parties, trying to gain the right to claim that they were the ones who enfranchised women. And I guess you might say that at this point, it might have been possible for women to be enfranchised nationally. And so these Wyoming legislators are sort of struggling for what they think will be a wonderful political prize.
Yeah. And you know, when you're talking about Wyoming becoming the first state or the first territory to enfranchise women.
It's also the first state. It was also the first state.
Yes. I think it's really so interesting because it gets down to the individual. William Bright up in South Pass City, you know, strong Democrat from Virginia, although he fought on the Union side. But I mean, he was one of those guys that was really offended that the 15th Amendment was going to be ratified. And he was the one who brought up legislation when he went to the first legislative session. So, you know, it's really kind of amazing how just individuals can shift the dynamics of the history and the story of not just suffrage, but anything. Again, the power of the individuals.
Well, especially when we're talking about a tiny territorial legislature. Yeah. I knew this was going to happen. I've done my best to prepare, but I knew all of you would know so much more about this story than I did. But yes, agreed. Bright was a Democrat. The governor, Campbell, was a Republican, correct?
Yes.
And then a year or two after the territorial legislature enfranchised women, perhaps it became clear that women's suffrage was not going to happen. And at that point, the territorial legislature tried to undo the enfranchisement of women, and it narrowly avoided doing so. It was vetoed. The governor vetoed it, and by one vote, the legislature failed to overdo his veto.
Yeah. And that's one of my favorite parts about this story is, you said most people don't know that Wyoming was a territory when they gave people suffrage. And when they do, they go, yay, Wyoming. But they don't know that Wyoming also tried to take it back 2 years later, because those 1,500 women that were voting in that first election, they sent a Republican to Congress to represent them. And so the Democrats thought the women had absolutely betrayed them, and they'll show them. They'll
That's
take away.
true. A couple other things to say. Yes, the story of Wyoming women's suffrage is just replete with legends, and is more famous than the legend of Esther Morris, the justice of the peace, who was credited early on with talking Bright and through his wife into supporting women's suffrage. There's still debate about it, I think, but it seems pretty clear that although she was one of the first women in the country to have a federally appointed office as a justice of the peace, which meant a judge, she still was not in any way responsible for the enfranchisement of women. I just wanted to add one other little part of the story. So I talked about Utah as well as Wyoming. When both of them come up for statehood in 1890 and 1890 something respectively, Congress tries to resist statehood from Wyoming and threatens them with not accepting statehood. Actually, it was because I think it was a Democratic Congress and Wyoming would have come in as a Republican state. But Congress threatens Wyoming not to accept statehood so long as women are enfranchised. And I guess women were still thought of as important to the Republican strength in Wyoming. And Wyoming stands by its women, which is the Wyoming legislators stand by their women. Conversely, Utah women who have an even bigger problem, which is Utah's statehood is objected to because of polygamy. They actually lose their right to vote because Congress takes it away, and it's only sometime later than Utah as a state re-enfranchises women.
Yeah. Now, I do have to stick up for Esther Hobart Morris just a little bit. So there was the legend going around by our early historian. Shoot, her name, it just flew out of my head. Anyway, that Esther Hobart Morris had this big tea party, and she invited the legislators, and she made them, swear whoever won that they would push. No, that never happened. But her subtle influence with Julia Bright, and the fact that she did bring in some of her very close friends who are also very pro-suffrage, and they spent the summer talking suffrage. Her influence, yes, thank you, Grace Raymond Hebert. Thanks, Mary. Why things fly out of my mouth or out of my head when I need them the most just always stuns me. But yeah, so the influence, and it was William Bright actually wrote something later on saying that Hobart's influence had been, and along with several other women, had been very important to him. But
this is an interesting discussion, because I don't think there's any other state in the Union in which women's suffrage, women's enfranchisement is as much a part of public knowledge as it is in Wyoming. It's just really an important part of the state's legacy. In which case, I wanted to point out one final detail, which when it comes time, I discovered this when I was writing the book. When it comes time to ratify the 19th Amendment, and there needs to be 36 states, ironically, some of the states that had enfranchised women, the earliest, among which was both Wyoming and Washington, did not rush to ratify because they were like, we've been voting for a long time. We don't need this. And when one of the national suffrage activists came to Wyoming to work for ratification, she found that there were virtually no women who had ever heard a suffrage speech. Suffrage had been an issue of their mothers and grandmothers.
Mhm.
Was an interesting detail for me.
Yeah.
And I think it changed because someone, I can't remember who, maybe it was a national suffrage leader, appeals to the state legislature and says, don't you want to preserve the honor of your state? You need to ratify.
Well, Wyomingites, we don't like to spend money if we don't have to. And this ratification thing came up in between legislative years, and it would have cost money for the legislators to go down there, and they supported it anyway. So
Yeah, we're statute light.
yeah,
What?
Cathy, you can add to that.
I just said we're statute light here.
Well, maybe that's the explanation.
Right.
Yeah.
It is something, I think, Ellen, as you said, that Wyomingites are incredibly proud of. And, it's our state moniker. We're the equality state, which I really want to talk about today. But I have a question about that time that I'm wondering, because it's relevant today as well. And especially in Wyoming, I mean, we have 150 years. We like to brag about our 150 years versus, the rest of the nation of 100 years. But we treat it as if it was not very contentious, right? I mean, we do, we will kind of try to figure out really what happened right then. And, I think, historians and others, we will regularly point out kind of the racial dimensions to it, the statehood dimensions to it. Those are important for us to bring back in. But I'm curious about the movement nationally where women were against the vote. Right, that notion that all women were in favor of the vote just is wrong. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that and how that kind of anti-movement, which wasn't just by men, there are also kind of strong women's organizations. What did that look like?
Well, I actually feel that it was predominantly, at least the power behind the throne, were male antis. And when I wrote this book, and I knew in the back of my head I would be asked, why did suffrage take so long?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking for that answer. The conclusion I came up with is it was politicians. It was political that opposed it. At the two moments in American history, in the 1870s and in the 1910s, these were periods of relative progressive development, but it was actually the progressive parties, the Republican Party, the first instance, and the Democratic in the second, who opposed women's suffrage. Because I'm diverging from your question, I'll try and get back to it. Because none of the parties felt that they could be sure that they could control women's votes. Women were in all parties, they were all classes, they weren't quite all races. And women, there was no partisan benefit to be gained by women's enfranchisement. And in fact, it's really not for 50 years that women's votes show up as any kind of partisan influence, which is part of your story, Cathy. But when you ask about anti-suffragists, people often make the equation between the women anti-suffragists and the women opposed to the ERA and to abortion. The difference is that women opposed to the ERA and the abortion were enfranchised. As we've learned from Amy Comey Barrett, the entry of women into political power does not, into political significance and influence, doesn't just flow in one direction or the other. It's claimed by all sides. So when it came to the ERA and the abortion movements, those are really led by women. Whereas there are women anti-suffragists. They first show up in any numbers in New York in 1894. They are particularly prominent during the ratification battle, especially in what became the last and final state, which is Tennessee. It's really interesting when there's been remarkably little research into what the opposition to suffrage was. And the assumption is usually, I'm going back to what I said about political parties. The assumption is usually that it's just free-floating sexism that among both men and women that is responsible. I actually don't think so. I think suffragists, when they went out into the hustings and they spoke to men, especially working class men, they were often able to gain support. The anti-suffrage women were, who always said, well, and maybe this does relate to the ERA, when they said, well, if women get the right to vote, they'll lose their influence, which is actually what Phyllis Schlafly said, they'll lose their influence. They were women who had influence. They were women whose husbands and fathers were wealthy, they were politically prominent. They could influence politics by appealing to these men who had political power, but other women had no political influence. And so they had nothing to lose when it came to winning the right to vote, which isn't to say that it didn't take them a long time to appreciate why women should have the vote. That was as long a struggle as anything else in the suffrage movement. Convincing not just radical women, and I know this is another question you want to ask, not just radical women, but common, conventional, middle class, small town, church-going women, that they had something to gain by gaining the right to vote. And it wasn't people like Elizabeth Stanton and Susie B. Anthony who convinced those women. It was women like the temperance leader Frances Willard who convinced conventional women that they had something to gain by winning the vote.
I have a question that kind of connects the two of you, the historian and the more contemporary legislator, someone who can see what's going on in not only Wyoming, but around the country today. Why is it that women were, again, needed to be convinced that there was a reason to gain suffrage, but also a reason to support women in politics? I mean, we see that now. We still see that.
It's taken a long time. When suffragists concluded the battle for the vote, they didn't put a lot of emphasis into women gaining political office. They were mostly arguing that women would be a nonpartisan force in politics. When we look at the League of Women Voters, which was formed out of the remnants of the suffrage movement in 1920, it began and actually remains as a nonpartisan organization. Women were supposed to be an influence that would sort of purge politics of the corruption and the ambition and the self-serving that even then attached to politics. So it was a much slower development for women to begin to again, here's your question, Cathy. When they first began to try to win political office, they usually ran for third parties, especially the Socialist Party. And these third parties, they subscribed to gender equality, but also they were never going to win anyhow. So there was no obstacle to putting women on the ballot. Women are much slower to gain any kind of position, very slow to gain any kind of position, not so much at the state legislatures, but at the national level in the major parties. By the first woman to gain any kind of, to become a member of the US Senate for longer than the few days between when her husband died and when there was a special election, was a New Deal Democrat named Hattie Caraway from Arkansas, who kept the seat for about 2.5 administrations, and she was replaced by J. William Fulbright. The second woman in the United States Senate was the famous Margaret Chase Smith. Caraway was a Democrat, Smith was a Republican. And then I don't know who the third one was, but it was a long time before that happened. So I generally say that women entering, sort of women becoming a voting bloc and women becoming at all attractive to the major parties as candidates was a product of the women's liberation movement, which sort of reinvigorated a whole generation. I wonder, Cathy, if it was hard for you to win your seat because you were a woman. And
my seat was held by a woman before me, and then a man before her and a woman before that. So my seat has been held by a woman for about 50 years -4.
wow.
And that's something that many people in the district know and are very proud of.
Did you know when you ran for it that you were running for a woman's seat?
Not to start with, but soon thereafter, that recognition came through. But that's not to say that I don't think that there isn't issue, sexism that comes into play with any female candidate in Wyoming. I have a zillion questions, but I see you have another one. You have one before we move to the contemporary times.
Oh, wait, we have one from Colleen who wanted to know if the temperance movement had more clout than the suffrage movement to get the suffrage amendment passed.
Well, I'm not quite sure. The Prohibition Amendment, which was the 18th Amendment, passed right before the 19th Amendment and passed more easily than the 19th Amendment. It passed very quickly. And interestingly enough, it was supported by many Southern legislators who said, no, we don't believe in federal constitutional amendments, except for the Prohibition Amendment. By that time, the movement against alcohol abuse, which had originally been called the Temperance Movement, had pretty much been taken over by men. So as I alluded to before, the temperance movement in the 1880s and 1890s was really responsible for bringing a mass, not quite a mass, but large numbers of Midwestern and Western women in small towns into the suffrage movement. The argument there, which isn't that hard for us to relate to today, is that alcohol abuse was something that was characteristic of mostly of men and affected women and families because men drank up their wages, and also because it was responsible for a lot of domestic abuse. So the argument that Frances Willard made was she had to rebrand suffrage. Already women's suffrage, already by 1878, women's suffrage was had a negative association with it. It was mannish women and radical women. And so she rebranded the campaign. She called it the Home Protection Ballot. So she said women needed this right to vote. They needed to go out into the public to gain the right to vote in order to protect their homes and families. And the basis of this, the essence of this argument, which was that women needed the vote, not because they were equal to men, or not so much equal, but that they were identical to men, that they were similar to men, but that they were different than men, and they had different concerns. They had female-specific concerns. And once Frances Willard dies and the temperance movement is not that influential anymore, 20th century women, labor organizers, urban reformers like Jane Addams, use the same argument. They say women are concerned with playgrounds and the quality of milk in cities and the conditions under which young girls work in factories. Those are female concerns, and women, the best example of this, and one that wins over the labor movement to the suffrage, is the argument that women will bring about an end to child labor, which was a concern of the labor movement. Now, in the end, it didn't happen that way because the Supreme Court would not allow laws against child labor. And it was really only in the 1930s that child labor ceased to be so crucial to the labor force, and it ended.
Yeah, thanks. Cathy, you had a question?
I did. I have one for both of you as historians. And I want to just tell you that, in any of these kinds of things that we do, you have to figure out what you're going to wear. And I thought about what to wear, and you can't read it very well at all. But this is a sweatshirt that says, "This is a movement, not a moment." And it's an illustration of a Wyoming teenager. This is Mishla Bovey, she's about 14 years old, African-American girl. And she has a microphone at one of the very first Black Lives Matters marches up in Casper, right? And one of the things she said that was made into a sweatshirt was, again, "This is a movement, not a moment." And I'm curious about thinking about suffrage and it being a moment, and then the moment that we all love in Wyoming and our first and our place, but it really was and has become a movement. It was a movement. It is a movement today. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, about how moments become movements, anything along those lines. And about, actually, Ellen, you even started talking a little bit about that, and about how revisionism is okay, in part when you think, oops, the context of a pandemic was something I didn't think much about. It's so relevant today. But a little bit, again, could you talk just a little bit about that whole moments and movements and the importance of history, honestly?
Okay, just that little subject.
Right, and you've got 4 minutes.
Well, I want to actually address that by talking about this moment and the Centennial, the Suffrage Centennial, which was organized and celebrated once Republicans took over the national government. So the Suffrage Centennial Commission, which was organized under the Trump administration and the McConnell Senate, had a range of people on it, but it was the predominant people who were on the commission were Republicans and very conservative people, including the head of what's called the Susan B. Anthony. The Susan B. Anthony something, which is an anti-abortion group. My mind's going as well. The Susan B. Anthony group, something like that. I remember watching the Republican convention. I know I'm one of the only people in the world who actually watched the Republican convention, but it was right after Trump pardons Susan B. Anthony. Which pardon Susan B. Anthony would have gotten up out of her grave and walked towards him and terrified him. She did not want to be pardoned. I don't think he had any idea why she was arrested. She was arrested for voting and for insisting that all national citizens had the right to vote. I doubt if he knew that. And then there was a lot of stuff during the Republican convention about celebrating suffrage. And I thought of writing an article, which I never did, called "Who Owns Women's Suffrage?" The Centennial. But the point I want to make here is that it's about your question of a moment versus a movement. The Centennial Commission encouraged us to look at suffrage as a moment, and the enfranchisement of women as a moment, a thing that happened. Not even thinking about why it happened, it just happened because, of course, American democracy is that way and things happen. That was unfortunate because it was important to connect the 19th Amendment to everything that went before and everything that came afterwards. I have a friend, Martha Jones, who says it's unfortunate that we use this old-fashioned word suffrage because it just alienates people from this development. If we talked about votes for women, which is what it was finally called in the 20th century, we could think about all those decades that 3 generations of women fought for as a kind of voter suppression. We could even look at the way that the 19th Amendment is written. It's written in such a way that it's not much of a tool against voter suppression. I can sort of explain that later if anybody wants me to, but the 19th Amendment and the 15th Amendment are written very weakly. W-E-A-K-L-Y. They sort of say states can't do anything explicitly linked to race, color, previous condition, or sex. They don't say people have the right to vote.
That's why we needed the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Exactly.
That's why, right? Yeah.
Right. And once that was gone, there was no congressional, exactly, Cathy, that's exactly right. And once the Voting Rights Act was eviscerated, or might we say emasculated, there was no congressional role to play in protecting people's right to vote.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
I'll take a much more local view of a moment that helped me conceptualize how Wyoming got the suffrage. And this is Wyoming is originated because of the railroad and a gold strike between when the Union Pacific got to the point that the border of what is now Wyoming, and in 1867 there were very few white people in the region, and within 2 years there were enough to petition for territorialhood. And so this influx of people, as you were mentioning earlier, a lot of men escaping Reconstruction South, but there are also a fair number of people coming from the Midwest. And this influx of people, the turmoil of post-Civil War, all sorts of ideas, all sorts of anxiety over the 15th Amendment, created a space for something to happen. But what was also important about this space is that people didn't have long-standing antagonisms with each other. It was a new neighborhood, in effect, and they didn't have long grudges, long battles with one another, long feuds over whether or not women should have the right to vote or not. It seemed expedient at the time. And at that time, they made a decision. And in that moment, a window opened very, very narrowly, but it opened. 2 years later, they tried to shut it again. But by that time, the moment had become a movement. And that's what helped move Wyoming's state of equality forward. But we've got some questions from people, and I want to get those in here.
Okay, go ahead.
Ellen, what is the historical access of Native women in Wyoming to vote, if any? Cathy, if not already doing so, could you talk about the legacy, memory, use of the history in the 21st century Wyoming legislature?
Okay, Native American women. Native American people, men as well as women, did not have any federal protection. They weren't really considered citizens, especially if they were tribal people. If they gave up their tribal affiliations and basically whitened, then they would only have to face down racism. But Native American people were not declared national citizens, not declared having the rights of national citizenship, for instance, the 14th Amendment, until the Native Rights Act, I think it's called, of 1924. At that point, the 19th Amendment having passed, women, Native women, as well as Native men, got the benefit of the Native Rights Act. Nonetheless, there were Native women who were prominent in not so much in the suffrage movement, but in campaigns for Native rights. And they were prominent writers and professional women, doctors. And so anyhow, that's the short answer. Native people did not have political rights really anywhere. I mean, maybe there was a state that gave that to them, but I can't imagine if places like Wyoming or Montana didn't give them rights. I can't imagine where they would have had rights if they were tribal people. Maybe, Renee, you know the answer to that better than I do.
And actually, it's places like Montana that push so hardly to keep Native peoples from having access to the right to vote.
Because there were so many, yes, because they were a significant number, right?
But Cathy, do you remember the question?
Sure, I've got it up here. First time
Okay.
here. Mir is another person in both Ellen's and my life from many years ago. So, and Mir is a historian now in North Carolina. I believe it is. Yes. So the legacy, memory, use of this history in the legislature, and again, we just have gone through some enormous celebrations, and the legislature has been very much part of those celebrations of Wyoming's kind of history of suffrage. And that's why I asked about it as, you know, a movement and a moment, because it's certainly my sense that it often is perceived as a moment. And it's a moment that we are very, very proud of. And I'm just going to give an example. The Wyoming had a visit from the Saudi ambassador this year, and I was invited to that dinner with the governor. And
did you wear a thing? Did you wear a thing?
I did not wear a thing. But it was Her Royal Highness.
Cool.
Right. So is Her Royal Highness Princess Rima bin Bandar Al Saud, I believe is her name, the first female ambassador, all right, to the United States from Saudi Arabia. Given our oil and Saudi's oil, that was a very kind of important visit. And there's always exchanges of gifts. And so the gift that was given to her, and I didn't know about this, was a beautiful kind of framed copy of women's suffrage in Wyoming. And it was presented by kind of the governor and male leadership. And kind of the discussion was about how important it is and was to Wyoming, and given her interest in women's rights in Saudi Arabia right now. All right. And so thinking about, you know, the question of, you know, is there legacy, memory, use? The answer is absolutely.
That's a great story. I'm taking that as my own. That's a great.
There you go. You can take that as your own. And I must admit, and so every kind of female in leadership in Cheyenne was invited. It was a small get together, but a Republican legislator leaned over to me and said something like, "I can't wait until all this suffrage is done." And in part because we recognize that it is not a moment. The notion of equality is something that we struggle for constantly here. And you know, folks know this, but we have the largest wage gap between men and women in the nation. I think we're like 48th or tied for 48th in terms of the number, the percentage of women in the legislature right now. Georgetown just came out with a report last week, where they did their kind of the use of their international index on the status of women globally to compare the states, and it was the best and worst states to be a woman, and Wyoming ranks 43rd across 12 different measures, right? There's a lot of work to be done, but that notion, and what's on our license plates, and right, every plate and every kid can talk about, we're the equality state. And so that legacy, our history, that moment is incredibly relevant, but it is looked at as a moment as opposed to the movement beforehand. And then, Ellen, what you talked about, what happened afterwards, and that notion of votes for women and the meaning of it has kind of gone astray. And honestly, just one little more example, we have a former female legislator who, in support of the statewide Republican Party censuring an individual because she supported a nonpartisan PAC to help elect more women in Wyoming, her response to that was, we don't need more women in Wyoming. We don't need more elected women in Wyoming because men can represent women just as well. Men are husbands, they're fathers, they have proven themselves. And so that, I mean, that old, honestly, what you were talking about in terms of history, that notion that representation doesn't per se matter because men can do it and do it well.
And so I think that state, the state motto, the equality state, it seems more like a box that we've checked off. Job done. Let's move on to something else.
It's amazing that that guy thought that he should lean over to you and say, I can't wait for this suffrage stuff to be over. I mean, it seems like a deliberate insult, but maybe he was just thoughtless.
Oh, no, this was a woman.
Oh, a woman.
Yeah.
Oh.
So I just have one quick story, because you asked Cathy earlier if we could talk about moments, and I was thinking about the anti-suffrage movement that you brought up, Ellen, and during the 2016 campaign, the Samantha Bee Full Frontal show, one of the reporters went to a Trump convention and asked a woman at the supporter why she wouldn't vote for Hillary Clinton. And the woman said, oh, I'd never vote for a woman. I said, well, why not? Because women, they're emotional, they're hormonal. They might push that button and start a war at any moment. And the reporter said, but there's never been a woman that started a war. It's always been men. And then she just walked away. But I thought that exchange was so telling about, it's not just men that fear having a woman in power, it's women as well. And until we can find a way to convince people that men and women are both they're all just intellectual beings and they have their pluses and minuses, it's gonna be really hard to bridge that divide.
There are a million stories like that, but that really makes me think. I'm often trying to understand, there's so much analogy between Black rights and women's rights. What's the similarity and what's the difference? And that story really captures the difference, which is you got to look under a lot of rocks before you can find a Black Republican, There
was one, but he died.
He was killed. Decades ago, there were African Americans who were a little timid about pushing too hard on Black rights, but never who thought Black, not at least in our times, that Black people did not deserve equality with white people. That's not the same. Your story absolutely captures a different fact, a different situation, which is lots of women believe that women are, who knows what happens in their houses? Who knows who gets yelled at more than who and who else? But nonetheless, when they are about ready to talk about public life, I don't know. It's one of the components of a kind of very deep-seated, very personal anti-feminism, which remains a mystery to me.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. We have a couple more questions.
Yeah,
It is 6:32. Do you want to look at the questions so I don't have to read them to you?
I think there's only one I see. Is that right?
Okay, well, let's take
Shannon?
that question.
Strange question about history repeating itself. Looking at the long arc of history, comparing the long suffrage battle and the Spanish flu epidemic hitting just at the end of the final ratification. How about the current pandemic and getting the long-suffering ERA passed? Is anyone exploring this? Is there a there? Well, there are two questions there. One is the pandemic. And I went looking, because I didn't address it in my book, I went looking to find out something about this. And I thought I would find examples of how the flu pandemic interfered with women's suffrage. I don't think it did. Although I have to say one thing, which is very few people ever acknowledged that they had the, I'll call it the Spanish flu. We now know that Woodrow Wilson had it, but he never said he had it. And I am sure that his flu was an element in his stroke. So I am wondering in 20 or 30 or 10 or 20 years down the road, if there'll be a kind of deliberate forgetting about, once we've lived through this, whether people won't write about COVID in their memoirs or in their biographies. They'll want to forget about it because it's too terrible. That having said, I do not think that the pandemic, the current pandemic, is particularly having a role in getting the ERA up and going again is going to be such a heavy lift. The real obstacle is going to be the Supreme Court, which will need to decide that the rule limiting ratification of the ERA to a limited number of years was unconstitutional. And it's hard for me to imagine that our current Supreme Court, especially once this new appointment comes onto it, will make that decision, in which case we're going to have to start from scratch.
I do see one other question. It's in the chat and it's from Nick Murdoch, and it's about voter suppression. And I mean, I'd like to comment on it right now. And Ellen, maybe you could comment on what
Can you
it
read
looks
it to me? I can't see it.
It says that recognizing that voter suppression is correlated with many socioeconomic factors, could you address voter suppression of women in the forms it takes? Maggie says, I can ask that even if I am an old white guy. So hello, Maggie and Nick.
You start, Cathy. I have a few ideas.
So one of the things that we know is that right now, and we just it follows up on the pandemic question, is that the pandemic has impacted Wyoming's women and men differently. And I think that it correlates around the nation, but what we know is that far more women have kind of lost their jobs and haven't gone back, and that far more women are responsible for taking care of children. And so when voting becomes more difficult, right, in terms of polls being consolidated, for example, things like that, right, it becomes physically more difficult to go and do your voting. Now, luckily, I mean, here in Albany County, we've done a pretty good job at making it relatively easy for people to vote. Early voting, actually, not only in Albany County, but in the entire state has been, I mean, 6-8 times what it was 4 years ago. At least we found that in the primary. And so Wyoming is doing better, it looks like, than the rest of the nation in terms of making early voting available. But that would definitely be anything that makes it more difficult to vote will make it more difficult for women because of those childcare responsibilities that are exacerbated right now.
Yeah, I don't really, the only thing I have to add to that is that a special factor affecting men is felon disfranchisement. And although there are women felons, they're not anywhere near or ex-felons, former felons. They're nowhere near the same number, although I think women's numbers are going up. Here in California, I have two friends who are ex-felons and women ex-felons, and we have a proposition to enfranchise ex-felons, and I'm desperately hoping it will win. But yeah, I think Cathy's answer is the right one.
Yeah, and you especially see this in some of the more rural states in the South, where you've got a government that's also not trying to, well, there is voter suppression. And so the suppression efforts by closing down polling stations, again, fits into that the difficulty that women have to vote.
I guess we would just have to add to this that Black women are taking the leadership in African American, progressive, democratic, activist efforts, and as such, they're going to be the object of deliberate voter suppression.
Can we say something happy and positive before we have to end? We've got about 1 minute.
Yeah, I gotta go to the debate. Oh, I'm sorry, you said positive.
Yeah.
I just want to say I'm thrilled to be doing this. Cathy and I go way back. When I moved out from Buffalo to Los Angeles, Cathy drove me 3/4 of the way. We told about the story. I don't know, were you in undergraduate? Were you a graduate yet?
Ellen, it took me 10 years to get my undergraduate degree. Who knows when I was in and out and all of that.
But she had been given, this is the end of the whole thing. She given a giant wheel of cheese by her family for Christmas, and that's all we ate from Buffalo to Arizona.
I think I had $20 in my pocket for a month, and that was we ate cheese.
So anyhow, thanks you all. I'm just sorry I haven't been able to come. I'll see you in 100 years when we do the next Centennial. Okay.
See you then. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure.
My pleasure.
Kathy, it's a pleasure and honor to have you with us as well. This has been great. So thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam Legislature. Bye, everybody. Thanks, everybody.